let's talk binding today. A lot of you asked for how I do my binding, specifically a tutorial on hand stitching the binding. So today in the studio I am working on finishing up this Alpine runner, and that's from my Trendy Table 3 book. So I'm working on finishing up all the models that will be going out on trunk show, so I've got a lot of binding coming up. And this one I worked on over the weekend, and I left a little spot that has no stitching here along the bottom so I could share with you more about my method. Now I use the French double fold method, so that means I cut my binding 2.5 inches wide. I press it in half, wrong sides together, and then I sew to the front side of the quilt, and then I'm going to flip this to the back and hand stitch down. Now I want to point out one of the most common mistakes that I see people make with this is that they sew their binding with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when you do that, you end up with a big empty gap here. And what you want is when you fold this to the back side, you want this binding to be completely filled. You don't want to fill the edge of the quilt and then an empty space of just air where it doesn't totally reach. So you want to be able to fold this perfectly to the back and have the edge of the quilt perfectly fill the binding. So you end up with roughly 1/6 of the width of your binding that's exposed. So if you take that 2.5 inches and divide that by 6, you get 0.41 something. So that's roughly 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now because you have the turn of the fabric and the thickness of the batting, it's going to be just slightly less than that. So a really scant 3/8 will usually fill that out perfectly. Then let's talk about the tools that I use. The first thing is I always use hand quilting thread when I do my stitching. Now hand quilting thread is thick and it has that nice glaze on it, and because it's thicker and stronger than just your standard quilting thread, I get by with using just one strand of thread, so that really cuts down on the tangling, and the extra thickness also makes it strong enough even though you're just using one strand. So first of all, hand quilting thread. The second thing is the needle. Now these are my favorite needles for binding. Can we get that in focus? Not really. I'll just tell you what it says. These are from Gina Kimball's. They're called Foxglove Cottage needles. Specifically, they're straw needles. So I'll say that again. Gina Kimball from Foxglove Cottage makes these straw needles. They make other types of needles too, but the straw needles are the ones that I like using for binding. And my favorite size is the 8. You can see how long and skinny that needle is. It's perfect for my method of binding. If that feels just a little bit too long for you, you can get the 9. Do you see how that's a little bit smaller? And the eye on the needle is fairly large, making them easy to thread. So I'm going to start out with the size 8, because like I said, that's my preferred size. Then let's talk about the threading. I know that sounds pretty basic, but sometimes people don't really know what end of the thread they should put through the eye of the needle. So I always take the end off the spool, and that's what my needle goes into. And I usually push the needle onto the thread, like so. And then you're going to pull this off. And I usually like a fairly long piece, and you're going to make a cut. Now if you are concerned about tangling, you can release some of the twist that is naturally applied to the thread in the manufacturing process, and you can do that just by running your fingernail along the edge of the thread. You can see that twist coming off there a little. I learned this from Natalie Channon. You can look up her company, Alabama Channon, if you want to learn a little bit more about that. And as far as making the knot, I usually just wrap it around my finger once, slide it off, and then use my other finger to pull the knot to the end, and you get a nice big knot like so. You can also do, now I want to show you how to do that quilter's knot again. So let's take the end, and I'm holding the end of the thread in my left hand, and I'm going to put it right next to my needle in my right hand and hold on to the end with my right hand. Then I'm going to wrap around the needle away from myself 1, 2, 3 times. Then with your left hand, you're going to grasp that tail in your left hand And then you're going to take your needle with your right hand and just pull the thread all the way through, holding on to that needle with, or that knot with your left hand. And when you're done, can you see there's a little knot there at the end? So that's another method for tying knots. You can, pick from your favorite of those two. Now let's just talk a little bit about why I take the end of the thread right off the spool, and that is the end that I thread into the needle. So during the manufacturing process, when the thread is made, it is twisted down towards the spool. So naturally, this end of the cut is going to be a little sharper, so easier to thread. And the other end that you cut off the spool, the end is gonna, if you're gonna, at it under a microscope or a magnifying glass, it sort of splays out. So that makes it a little bit harder to thread. And also in that manufacturing process with the twisting, you get any loose fibers kind of fling out towards the bottom or towards the spool. So if you were to thread the other end, the whole time you're sewing, you're kind of working against those little small fibers that are sticking out. So by working from the top that comes off the spool, that keeps those little fibers nice and smooth along there, and you have to fight that a little bit less. It's, probably a small difference, but I just wanted you to understand why I have you doing it that way. Okay, so in my earlier videos, I shared a couple of the tools that I use for the binding, and I shared a little bit about the physics of the hand stitching and the thread. Now we're going to talk about the method that I use for hand stitching my binding, and I'm going to try to make this a little bit quicker process for you. So for those of you who find binding to be putsy or tedious, hopefully this will make things go a little quicker. So let's just talk about how the quilt is laid out here. I have the backing facing up. I have my needle in my right hand because I'm right-handed, and I'm going to have my left hand guiding the fabric. That's what's going to fold this under for me, and rather than using pins or binding clips, I just clamp, I've got the binding in my hand, which I clamp down, and then this thumb clamps, and this finger is right underneath where I'm stitching. So that holds that stable, so I don't need to use the clips or the pins that my thread ends up tangling on. Now the method that I use to make this go faster, so on your very first stitch, you're going to go in between the layers, and you're going to come up and get just a couple threads of the edge of the binding. Do you see how there's just a few threads there? And then what you're going to do, and now you can zoom out a little bit, is I'm going to pull out a tail. Zoom in a little bit more so you can see where my needle is. This little tail right here to here is like 5 inches or so. So I didn't pull that whole long piece of thread through on that stitch. Now what we're going to do is do a whole bunch of stitches until we use up just this little tail. So again, let's show how that stitch is done. I'm going to go in between the layers, come up and grab just a few threads, and you see how I'm using my fingernail right there to kind of help guide the needle so I get it exact. So I get just a few threads. So that needle or that thumb on my left hand acts as both a needle and or a pin and a guide. So you're going to do a whole bunch of stitches using just that little tail until that's used up. Now zoom out just a little, and then watch how I pull that whole thing through all at once. So because I'm using the hand quilting thread, which has kind of got that glaze and it's a little stronger, and I'm only using a single strand, it's really easy to do that pull technique. And look how much time that saves by being able to pull through all those stitches in one motion as opposed to pulling each long stitch all the way through. So let me show that to you one more time. So again, I'm going to use my left hand to kind of fold over the fabric and hold it in place. I'm going to get my thumb ready. I'm going to go in between the layers with the needle, come up and get just a little bit of the binding fabric, pull through a tail. Can you see my tail? About 5 inches or so. Then you're going to do a bunch of those stitches in a row. And the length of my stitch is maybe just under 1/4 of an inch. Too small and it takes forever, and too big and I think it looks sloppy. So that roughly that 1/4 inch is the size that I like. Now once that 5-inch tail is used up, again I'm going to do that pulling technique and pull that through all at once. And then if you can get a close-up, Joel, of the stitching when it's done, you see how that the stitching is pretty close to being hidden. And as far as thread color goes, I usually match my thread color to my binding, but the store has been out of red hand quilting thread lately when I've gone, so I matched it to my backing. So either way it works, but if this was red, it would be even a little bit more hidden. You can see those little bites of thread that I have there. But that's my method for doing my stitching and going quickly around the quilt. I usually tell people that my goal is I have a queen size quilt done in a movie, like a 2-hour movie. It means I don't watch any of the movie, but I get to listen to it, and it entertains me a little bit while I do it. So I hope you find that helpful. So if you're interested in this pattern, you can find it in my Trendy Table 3 book. And if you're interested in trying out these needles I mentioned, I have the size 8 available in my online shop. So for both, you can go to angustreasures.bigcartel.com.